and Jasmine was determined to draw it back. Armed with damning evidence, she didn't just challenge a narrative, she confronted a media empire. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom became a battleground where reputations were on trial and the very meaning of accountability was re-examined. The tension was palpable, the stakes unprecedented, and as the jury delivered its verdict, the world held its breath. And now, with the nation watching, only one question remains. What sentence will history deliver to the view? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It began like a controlled detonation, silent at first, but lethal by design. Just after dawn on a Monday morning, Jasmine Crockett's legal team strode into the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., armed not with cameras or headlines, but with something far more dangerous, a second lawsuit, this time sharpened to cut through media armor. The papers were thick, 127 pages of meticulously compiled evidence, time-stamped clips, internal memos, and damning off-air audio recordings. Filed with the precision of a scalpel and the force of a wrecking ball, the suit alleged retaliatory defamation, willful malice, and continued misconduct by The View's hosts, all while under active litigation. Within 2 hours of the filing, leaks began flooding through the industry like a cracked dam, one outlet calling it the most explosive lawsuit filed against a media giant in over a decade. By midday, ABC's top floor was in lockdown. Boardroom lights burned long past business hours as executives scrambled to contain what one insider bluntly described as a corporate hemorrhage. Jasmine's second strike wasn't just a legal move. It was a calculated assault on arrogance, and the shockwaves were immediate. Phone lines jammed. Sponsors, some of them worth 7 figures, pulled out with surgical speed, citing risk exposure and reputation misalignment. The mood at The View's studio turned funereal. Joy Behar reportedly stormed off set during a rehearsal, shouting that they let this girl weaponize the courts. Sunny Hostin, normally calm and polished, was seen pacing the hallways, frantically texting legal counsel. Whoopi Goldberg said nothing, not on air, not off, just silence, the kind that screams louder than any denial. Emergency meetings were called every 3 hours. The network's crisis protocol folder, something rarely touched, was now dog-eared and coffee-stained from overuse. And still, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. Not a tweet, not a quote, no interview, only the lawsuit and the deadly calm of a woman who knew this time she wasn't just responding, she was retaliating with the weight of truth, and the law was on her side. And just when the smart move was silence, when the world was watching, when lawyers had issued internal memos begging for discretion, when advertisers were already slipping out the back door, The View made a catastrophic choice. They spoke, loudly, publicly, and with the kind of smug defiance that only comes from years of unchallenged power. The cameras rolled, the lights flared, and inside that glowing studio, 3 women seated at the table leaned not into reflection, but into fire. Joy Behar, eyes sharp with sarcasm, sat forward like a boxer before the bell, and threw the first blow without blinking. She's just the mouthpiece of the radical left, a walking headline with no real depth. The words sliced across the air, and the audience, programmed for laughter, obliged. But this time, the laughter didn't land like humor. It landed like complicity. You could almost hear the collective gasp that never made it to air, the discomfort curling at the edges of the room like smoke no one wanted to acknowledge. Then came Sunny Hostin, her voice cooler but no less deliberate. She didn't just critique Jasmine Crockett, she stripped her of legitimacy. "This lawsuit," she said, gesturing dismissively, "it's not justice. It's a publicity tactic, another stage performance from the progressive media machine." The phrase was elegant in tone, venomous in meaning. Her words painted Jasmine not as a woman standing against a machine, but as the puppet of one, undermining the entire premise of the lawsuit with a single sentence. But it wasn't over. The final cut came from Whoopi Goldberg, who had been silent until then, fidgeting with her glasses. And then, without a trace of irony, she delivered what would become the most damning line of all. "Let's be honest. She should be grateful we gave her a seat at this table. Otherwise, no one would even know who she is." Those words did not echo. They detonated, not just in the studio, but across the legal battlefield Jasmine was quietly preparing. The arrogance was breathtaking. These were not offhand remarks. These were intentional provocations made on national television by individuals fully aware they were under legal scrutiny. It was not a misstep. It was a declaration of disdain, a public mockery of the very foundation of Jasmine's lawsuit. They weren't just daring her to respond, they were daring her to try and stop them. But what they didn't see, blinded by cameras, applause, and their own echo chamber, was that Jasmine Crockett had already stopped talking. She didn't need to clap back. She didn't need the last word. Because somewhere behind those courtroom doors, in silence and strategy, her evidence was being sharpened. And this time, it wasn't for attention. It was for blood. They thought it would disappear in the noise, that a few sarcastic comments, a smug laugh, and a little studio applause would fade away by nightfall. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't chasing attention. She was chasing accountability. And while the audience at home laughed, her legal team was already moving. The moment Whoopi Goldberg said, "Otherwise, no one would even know who she is," the clock started ticking again. In a private office in Washington, D.C., Jasmine's team kicked off a process they'd prepared for, collecting and preserving live evidence. No one needed to ask what to do. Everyone moved with purpose. One group downloaded the full studio broadcast, the raw, unedited version with time codes and separate audio channels. Another group began comparing the new footage to the original lawsuit. They were looking for one thing, proof that The View had not only ignored the lawsuit, but doubled down on attacking Jasmine. The audio was analyzed in extreme detail. Technicians listened carefully to background voices, laughter, even the tone in which each word was delivered. At the same time, the team compared those statements to emails ABC had already handed over during the first round of legal discovery. That's when they found it. An email from ABC's legal department warning the show's producers and hosts not to mention Jasmine Crockett or the case on air. That message was sent 2 days before the episode aired. It had been read, it had been acknowledged, and it had been ignored. That discovery changed everything. Why? Because in the eyes of the law, it's one thing to make a mistake. It's another thing entirely to know you're under legal scrutiny and keep attacking someone anyway. Jasmine's lawyers immediately began writing a new section of the lawsuit. This wasn't just about defamation anymore. It was now about retaliation, the deliberate targeting of someone already taking legal action with full awareness and intent. The team created a detailed chart. One column for each comment made by the hosts, one for the legal violation it represented, and another for similar past cases that set precedent. This wasn't opinion. This was strategy. Each line of dialogue from the show was being turned into a building block of a much bigger legal case. Joy Bihar's comment, calling Jasmine a mouthpiece for the radical left, was no longer just rude. It was now classified as an attempt to destroy reputation during litigation. Sunny Hostin's jab about the lawsuit being a publicity stunt was recorded as intentional undermining of legal credibility. And Whoopi's remark? It was seen as an effort to erase Jasmine's public worth, a classic sign of platform abuse. Legal experts didn't mince words. One media law professor, after reviewing the full segment, called it a textbook case of what not to do when you're being sued. Now, Jasmine's team wasn't just fighting a talk show segment. They were building a case to prove that The View, and by extension, ABC, had used their platform to intimidate and humiliate a legal opponent. They weren't commenting on the news. They were trying to control it. Jasmine had come to court for protection. They met her with mockery. And that wasn't just unjust. It was a direct violation of how media and power should operate in a democracy. She didn't shout back. She didn't take the bait. While headlines buzzed, Twitter exploded, and studio lights faded, Jasmine Crockett did exactly what they didn't expect. She remained silent. But her legal team didn't. They labeled every statement, cited every precedent, and wrote the new section of the complaint with unshakable calm. One paragraph read, "Defendants engaged in repeated and intentional attacks on the plaintiff. With clear knowledge of active litigation, in violation of legal norms and with reckless disregard for the truth. The segment on The View lasted just 8 minutes, but in the courtroom, those 8 minutes would echo for years. And when the last piece of evidence was in place, when the audio had been dissected, the transcripts notarized, the broadcast footage cross-referenced down to the millisecond, Jasmine Crockett's legal team unleashed the storm. They didn't walk into court. They marched. The second lawsuit was filed in federal court at exactly 9:42 a.m., stamped and logged in a thick red folder labeled Escalated Action, High-Profile Defamation. It wasn't filed quietly. It wasn't strategic whispering. It was a legal declaration of war, 137 pages long, armed with new evidence, expert affidavits, in a tone that made it clear this was no longer about seeking apology. This was about demanding accountability. Attached were side-by-side timelines showing the first lawsuit's progression and the continued on-air attacks. There were quotes from retired judges stating that ABC's response wasn't just poor judgment, it was an act of institutional recklessness. And perhaps most chilling of all was the conclusion drawn by Jasmine's attorneys. The defendants, with knowledge of ongoing litigation, weaponized their platform to deliberately injure, belittle, and publicly retaliate against the plaintiff in violation of basic legal boundaries and professional ethics. The 3 central allegations laid out in the complaint were sharpened like surgical blades. First, continued public defamation, where The View's host persisted in misrepresenting Jasmine's character on national television, not once, but across multiple episodes, even after the first lawsuit was in full motion. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, and that distinction was crucial. Second, intentional distortion of public perception during litigation, a serious accusation in federal defamation law. Jasmine's legal team argued that the hosts knew exactly what they were doing, undermining her credibility while she was under court protection, effectively trying to discredit her case by ridiculing the plaintiff in real time. And third, severe damage to professional reputation, citing not only viewer reactions and online harassment, but also internal memos from political donors and committee chairs who had begun distancing themselves from her amid the media frenzy. The damage wasn't theoretical, it was measurable, documented, and, most importantly, avoidable had the defendants not chosen to escalate. To support these claims, the filing included expert testimony from communication scholars and media ethicists, some of whom had worked on major First Amendment cases. One scholar wrote, "The behavior of the defendants demonstrates a contempt for judicial process and a disturbing willingness to override ethical standards for the sake of performative outrage." A retired appellate judge submitted a sworn statement emphasizing how rare it was for a media defendant to so flagrantly disregard legal caution. But it was a quote from Professor Harold Vance, a senior faculty member in media law at Georgetown, that echoed most powerfully through legal circles. This isn't a legal defense, it's a collapse in judgment. At this point, the only question left is what Jasmine Crockett wants printed on the check. That quote made it into the national headlines within hours, and into the opening summary of the complaint itself. But beyond the paper, beneath the structure of clauses and citations, lay something deeper. Jasmine Crockett wasn't fighting for a retraction. She wasn't filing out of pettiness or ego. She was standing up to a media institution that had mocked her, minimized her, and dismissed her humanity on live television, all while she was exercising her right to legal recourse. This wasn't just about what was said. It was about how it was said, in unison, with laughter, with smugness, in front of a national audience trained to applaud. And when that kind of behavior comes from a platform with the reach of ABC, it doesn't just bruise reputations. It rewrites public perception. And that's what Jasmine was fighting to reclaim, not just her name, but the truth that name stood for. So the lawsuit didn't come as a whisper. It came as a reckoning, backed not by outrage, but by evidence. It didn't beg for fairness, it demanded justice. And by the time the complaint was delivered to ABC's general counsel, there was no denying what had just happened. The conversation had shifted. This was no longer a media feud. It was federal litigation at full velocity, with the potential not just to punish, but to set precedent. Certainly. Here's the rewritten version of the passage above with the same content, structure, and intensity, but in clearer, more accessible English, while keeping the cinematic drama and emotional depth fully intact. While Jasmine Crockett's second lawsuit was moving powerfully through federal court, packed with clear evidence and expert backing, something very different was happening inside ABC's headquarters. It was chaos, real, loud, and out of control. The moment the broadcast ended, the mood in the building shifted from nervous to explosive. In the control room, where producers usually worked in calm coordination, people were now yelling over each other in panic. One senior producer slammed a binder on the table so hard it cracked and shouted, "We warned them! That memo went out days ago! Why did they still go there?" No one answered, because everyone knew why. The host had ignored the legal warning and gone ahead anyway. Live on air, mocking Jasmine Crockett right in the middle of an active lawsuit. That warning memo, once private and confidential, was now spreading across the studio like wildfire. It had come from ABC's own legal department, marked urgent on-air risk. It clearly told the hosts of The View not to mention Jasmine Crockett at all, not her lawsuit, not her name, not even vague references. The memo even gave specific phrases to avoid. But instead of following it, the hosts had done the opposite. And now that document was leaked, shared in emails, whispered about in meetings, and shown around like a smoking gun. The problem wasn't just what they said, it was that they were told not to, and they did it anyway. That made it more than a mistake. That made it legally dangerous. Tension spread through the office like a virus. Associate producers, who usually cared about segment timing and lighting setups, were now quietly searching legal terms and asking, can we be held responsible for what they said? A floor manager, pale and shaking, was overheard saying, "This is no longer a media issue. This is real legal trouble." Senior staff locked themselves in meeting rooms. HR started getting emails from employees asking to review their contracts and severance packages. A junior team member was seen crying in the hallway after being told, "You'd better keep a record of everything. People will start looking for someone to blame." The next morning, the atmosphere on set was completely different. There was no laughter, no jokes in the dressing room, no small talk in the makeup chair. Just silence, cold, heavy, and full of fear. And through all of it, one name hung in the air like a shadow: Jasmine Crockett. She didn't say anything. She didn't post. She didn't even show up. But somehow her silence echoed through every hallway. They had tried to humiliate her on live television, and now she was the one in control. She had followed the law. She had stayed quiet. She had let the evidence speak for her. And now the ones who once mocked her were scrambling, unprotected and afraid. Upstairs in the boardrooms, ABC executives were holding emergency calls with lawyers across the country. Some were arguing, trying to save what was left. Others were already preparing for resignations. But the damage had already been done. The question wasn't, how do we fix this? It was, who takes the fall? And the worst part? They were warned. Jasmine didn't trap them. They walked into it themselves. And now the price was coming due. And as the atmosphere inside ABC shifted from panic to paralysis, the consequences of arrogance began cutting into the network's most vulnerable artery: money. Less than 24 hours after Jasmine Crockett's second lawsuit was filed in federal court, a chain reaction began, one not driven by opinion, but by numbers, contracts, and the cold logic of corporate self-preservation. The first warning sign came in the form of a terse email from a global automotive sponsor. Effective immediately, all ad placements related to The View are suspended. We do not align our brand with content currently involved in active defamation litigation. No phone call, no apology, just a clean, immediate break. Within the hour, 2 more major advertisers followed suit, both from the pharmaceutical industry, both citing reputational risk exposure and invoking early termination clauses buried deep in legal fine print. By sunset, the ad team had tallied the losses. More than $7 million in scheduled sponsorships wiped out in one day. The kind of losses that don't just hurt profit margins. They draw boardroom blood. But it didn't stop there. The real devastation hit in what didn't happen: the silence from partners who had been weeks away from launching full-scale campaigns with the show. ABC's year-long strategic rebranding initiative for The View, a glossy multi-channel marketing push designed to frame the show as the last bastion of fearless daytime journalism, was officially frozen. A team of over 30 people, including media consultants, creative directors, and digital advertisers, were told to stop all outbound work. Design assets were pulled from cloud servers. Scheduled podcast crossovers were quietly canceled. A $1.2 million partnership with a major tech sponsor that was set to launch the following week vanished overnight after a closed-door legal review. The campaign had included billboards, targeted social media roles, branded interviews, and even a segment feature on Good Morning America. Now, none of it would see the light of day. Internally, the message was chilling in its precision. An email marked URGENT:"internal" only circulated among the marketing and legal departments. It read, "All active and planned marketing related to The View is suspended until a full legal risk assessment is completed. This includes paid media, earned media, and co-branded promotions. Do not engage with talent or partners regarding status." The freeze wasn't just financial, it was symbolic. It said in plain terms that ABC no longer trusted its own product enough to promote it. For Jasmine Crockett, this was never about destruction. It was about accountability. But the ripple effect of her legal stand had turned into a tidal wave that struck ABC at its core. Not because she shouted, not because she staged a press war, but because she had the truth and she had the proof. And they, so sure of their invincibility, had handed her both. Live on national television. In a matter of hours, The View transformed from a money-making machine to a legal liability no one wanted to touch. Not advertisers, not sponsors, not even internal executives. The network's most powerful voices were now radioactive, not for what they believed, but for what they ignored. And in the quiet that followed, the most expensive sound of all was the one they could no longer afford: denial. But financial collapse was only the beginning. The reckoning was still to come, and it would unfold not in boardrooms or behind studio walls, but in a federal courtroom where cameras were barred, but history was watching. In that room, spin would be meaningless. In that room, power would not speak louder than truth. It would be tested by it. After weeks of tense standoffs, secret negotiations, and failed settlements, the case of Crockett versus American Broadcasting Companies, Inc. was officially called to trial. By dawn, the courthouse was surrounded. Reporters jostled for space outside security barricades. Legal analysts camped in folding chairs. Camera crews fed live updates to every major news network in the country. The crowd wasn't just large, it was electric. Hundreds stood in line for a seat inside, knowing they wouldn't just be watching a trial, they would be witnessing a moment of reckoning in American media history. And then, when the doors opened and the bailiff called her name, Jasmine Crockett stepped in, with no words, no expression, and no need to explain her presence. She wore a plain navy suit, no stylist, no press agent, just her legal team, walking beside her with locked jaws and a black-wheeled case so tightly sealed it might as well have held state secrets. Within ABC's own legal files, it had already earned a name whispered with dread: the kill file. Inside the courtroom, the air felt thinner, like pressure was building invisibly. The judge's gavel had barely dropped when Jasmine's lead attorney, a former federal prosecutor known for his restraint and ruthlessness, stepped forward and cued the first exhibit. The screens flared to life. The silence broke. And what followed was a precise, devastating unraveling of a media machine that thought it was untouchable. First came the raw video, crisp, slow-motion playback of the show's most explosive moments. Joy Behar scoffing as she called Jasmine a radical puppet, Sunny Hostin smirking as she dismissed the lawsuit as a PR stunt, and Whoopi Goldberg leaning forward, adjusting her glasses, and delivering the infamous line, "She should be lucky we ever put her on." The clips weren't shown for shock value. They were synchronized with timestamps, legal filings, and network production notes. Everything was documented, verified, weaponized. Then came the real crack in the armor. A projected internal ABC memo marked strictly confidential and dated 2 weeks before the episode aired. In plain language, it read, "Hosts are advised to avoid any mention of representative." Jasmine, Crockett, or related legal actions until reviewed by counsel. This is not optional. No one in the room moved. Some scribbled. Most just stared. But the prosecution wasn't finished. Screens shifted again, this time revealing email chains between producers and hosts. One message stood out, sent from an associate producer to an unnamed talent. "You sure you want to go there? Legal already flagged this. Talking about Crockett could get ugly." The reply came 2 minutes later. It was curt, arrogant. "We'll handle it. The audience eats this up." And then came the moment that turned the trial from serious to seismic. Jasmine's attorney pressed play on a short audio clip, a hot mic feed not meant for broadcast, a private comment recorded off camera inside the View's studio just minutes before the show went live. It wasn't edited, it wasn't dramatized, it was real, and it was damning. The voice was calm, familiar, authoritative. It was unmistakably Whoopi Goldberg. "Let it blow. We spin better than that little girl ever could." For nearly 10 seconds after the audio ended, the courtroom remained frozen. No rustling, no murmuring. Just silence so thick it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. Judges leaned back in their chairs. Reporters stopped typing mid-sentence. The gallery, packed with lawyers, politicians, and journalists, sat stunned, not just by the words but by the brutal clarity of what they revealed. This wasn't miscommunication. This was premeditated retaliation, captured by their own microphones, wrapped in their own arrogance. And Jasmine? She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She sat as she had entered, quiet, focused, immovable. Because this wasn't about theater. It was about truth dressed in evidence. And now that truth had been unleashed in full view of the court, what had once been dismissed as a political stunt was now unfolding as a structured, deliberate assault on a woman who dared to hold power accountable, not just in her words, but in her silence. And as the weight of Jasmine Crockett's evidence settled over the courtroom like a loaded sky, the defense finally made their move, not with denial, but with misdirection. ABC's legal counsel stood, straightening his jacket like a man preparing for a stage, and delivered the argument they had been rehearsing for weeks. Calm, polished, persuasive, he tried to reframe the entire case as a misunderstanding of intent. "This show," he began, voice steady and practiced, "is entertainment. Its very purpose is to provoke dialogue, to challenge, to satirize. The View is not a courtroom. It is not a political weapon. It's a panel of opinionated voices doing what they've always done, engaging in cultural commentary." Then he pivoted toward Jasmine Crockett without ever saying her name directly. Yes, the plaintiff is a public figure, and with that role comes responsibility, comes scrutiny, comes criticism, sometimes harsh, but that is the price of visibility in a democracy. The First Amendment protects exactly this kind of speech. There was a stillness in the room, not from agreement, but from discomfort. The argument wasn't new. It was the same shield powerful media entities had used for decades. We weren't attacking, we were entertaining. But this time, it didn't land clean. Jasmine's attorney stepped forward, not with fire, but with force. His rebuttal began not with outrage, but with law. "We are not here to debate the value of free speech," he said. "We are here because my client was deliberately ridiculed by a media institution that knew it was under legal scrutiny, that received internal warnings to stop, and still chose to escalate. That's not protected speech. That's premeditated retaliation." Then he opened a leather-bound folder and began reading case law. New York Times Covey Sullivan, Hustler Magazine versus Falwell, Gertz v. Welch. One by one, he traced the line where opinion ends and defamation begins. The moment your words are framed as truth, the moment you knowingly lie, the moment you seek to destroy someone's public trust, not by disagreement, but by humiliation, you've crossed into illegality. The defense tried to shift again, insisting the statements were jokes, that no serious viewer would take them as literal. But Jasmine's team countered with viewer analytics, polling data, and real-world impact. They showed how online harassment against her spiked after each broadcast, how misinformation spread from that very episode had been quoted in political forums and blogs. These weren't just jokes, her lawyer continued. They were signals. They were instructions. And they were delivered by voices that carry institutional weight. But it was what came next that pierced the room like ice. The prosecution called to the stand Dr. Marshall Klein, one of the most respected media ethics scholars in the country. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words cut because they were quiet, measured, undeniable. I've consulted on over 40 cases of media ethics disputes, Dr. Klein began, looking directly at the jury. And in those, I've seen arrogance. I've seen carelessness. But rarely have I seen this level of institutional defiance. A network informed of legal risk, explicitly warned, and yet choosing to proceed, not despite those warnings, but because of them. He paused, then delivered the blow. If the View is not held accountable here, then we are not just failing Jasmine Crockett. We are telling every network in America that the law is a suggestion, not a boundary. That humiliation is entertainment. That bullying becomes comedy if filmed in front of a studio audience. The room fell silent again, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. The defense's argument, once so confident, now sounded like a leftover excuse from another era. Jasmine Crockett had not sued over discomfort. She had sued over deliberate harm, inflicted by people who knew better and who chose to act anyway. And now, for the first time in the trial, it was no longer just a legal battle. It was a moral line, and the court had to decide which side it stood on. And after 48 hours of unrelenting courtroom intensity, hours filled with piercing testimony, irrefutable evidence, and the unraveling of media arrogance disguised as satire, the jury vanished into deliberation, and the world held its breath. They had seen everything. The high-definition playback of mockery, the internal memos ignored, the hot mic recording that left no doubt about intent. For 2 full days, the courtroom had been a battlefield of truth and evasion. But when the door closed behind the 12 jurors, their decision came not with hesitation, but with clarity. Just 3 hours later, they returned. Not a single juror looked confused. Their expressions were calm, resolute. The room braced as the judge re-entered, his robe whispering over marble floors, his face composed but heavy with finality. The gallery fell silent. No murmurs, no coughs, no movement. Everyone knew the weight of what was about to be said. The judge opened the file, adjusted his glasses, and with the authority of someone who'd spent decades separating noise from justice, began. In the case of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett versus American Broadcasting Companies Incorporated, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff. A ripple of gasps moved through the audience. A few heads turned toward ABC's table, but the judge wasn't finished. His voice never wavered as he delivered the consequences line by line, each word carving itself into the silence like a chisel through stone. The defendants, The View and ABC, are ordered to pay $1 million in damages for sustained acts of public defamation and retaliatory misconduct. Then came the second blow. ABC shall deliver a formal televised apology to air during national prime time within 72 hours using language approved by the court. And then, the verdict that no one in the studio had believed possible. Per recommendation from ABC's Internal Ethics Board, and in light of evidence of willful, repeated misconduct, Ms. Whoopi Goldberg, Ms. Joy Behar, and Ms. Sunny Hostin are to be immediately removed from their positions on The View. The silence shattered. It wasn't shouting or outrage. It was the quiet implosion of power, the sound of careers ending in real time. One of ABC's attorneys reached for a water glass and missed. A junior paralegal dropped her pen and didn't pick it up. Whoopi Goldberg, once the centerpiece of the show, sat utterly still. Joy Behar turned her head toward the floor and didn't look back up. Sunny Hostin exhaled, long and slow, like someone realizing she had crossed a line she could never return from. No one spoke. No one protested. There was nothing left to say. Every defense they had offered, it was just satire. She's a public figure. It was only commentary, had been stripped of meaning under the weight of sworn testimony, federal precedent, and their own recordings. And across from them, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She did not smile. She did not rise in triumph. She remained seated, posture steady, hands resting calmly in her lap. She had never raised her voice. She had never needed to. Because while the world underestimated her resolve, while seasoned media veterans tried to make her a punchline, she built her case like a fortress, brick by brick, fact by fact, until the truth stood taller than all of them. And now the verdict was not just a legal victory, it was a reckoning, a declaration that in a world so eager to weaponize words, truth still has a cost, and sometimes it gets paid in full. And as the final ruling echoed through the marble walls of the courthouse, the aftermath didn't roll in quietly. It erupted. What had begun as a courtroom drama became an international media phenomenon within hours. Newsrooms scrambled. Headlines lit up. Phones rang non-stop in editorial departments across every major network. Jasmine Crockett's name wasn't just trending, it was dominating every platform, every hour, every demographic. The Wall Street Journal ran a full-page feature above the fold with a headline that needed no decoration: Jasmine Crockett, the woman who brought a media empire to its knees. Cable news anchors who once dismissed the case as another flashpoint in America's outrage cycle were now reading prepared statements with visible astonishment. MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, each with their own political angle, each forced to confront the same undeniable fact. Jasmine Crockett had won, decisively, legally, and symbolically. Within 12 hours, ABC's court-mandated apology aired nationwide. It was stark, no graphics, no music, just a cold, static camera on a senior executive reading from a legal script approved by the judge. We at ABC and The View apologize unreservedly to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett for statements made that did not meet the standards of integrity, respect, or truth. That 60-second broadcast, aired simultaneously across ABC's primetime slots, was clipped, reposted, and dissected in real time. Within 12 hours, the video had over 30 million views across YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. Reactions ranged from stunned silence to standing ovations. On Twitter, one user wrote, "That wasn't an apology. That was a corporate surrender under court order." The internet, for once, was united, not by outrage, but by awe. Social media became a living monument to the trial. On TikTok, creators stitched together courtroom footage with clips from The View, drawing brutal side-by-side comparisons. A viral edit showed Jasmine sitting silently as Whoopi delivered the infamous "she should be grateful" line, then cut straight to the moment the judge announced her termination. Twitter users resurrected the hashtag Crockett Strikes Back, but this time it wasn't a protest, it was a celebration. Political commentators from both sides of the aisle weighed in, not just on the legal implications, but the cultural impact. One thread, retweeted over 90,000 times, read, "This wasn't a lawsuit. This was a mirror held to an industry that forgot truth has limits." She didn't yell. She didn't crack. She just documented and delivered. Jasmine Crockett, once mocked as just another politician chasing the spotlight, had become something entirely different, a symbol of restraint, weaponized by precision. In the days that followed, praise poured in from unexpected corners. Constitutional law scholars hailed the trial as a landmark. Journalists who had built careers inside the very media circles Jasmine challenged were now forced to reckon with the case as precedent. One Pulitzer-winning editor wrote in The Atlantic, "This was a siren in the dark, a warning shot to every talk show, podcast, and pundit panel that thought legal risk could be laughed away." Entertainment law firms issued memos to their clients. Training sessions were restructured. Suddenly, defamation under active litigation became a phrase discussed seriously in corporate boardrooms, not just legal textbooks. Networks across the country quietly began auditing their own content, rewatching past episodes, flagging any segment that even resembled what had happened on The View. Jasmine's victory hadn't just set an example. It had set a new legal and cultural standard. But Jasmine herself remained silent. No victory laps, no press tour, no celebratory roundtables, no media circuit she could have rightfully dominated. While journalists begged for quotes and producers offered exclusive interviews, she declined all requests. She didn't take the microphone. She didn't need to. The morning after the verdict, with the world buzzing, she simply posted a single sentence to her social media accounts. Just 12 words. "You don't have to shout. The truth is loud enough on its own." That line, calm, sharp, and utterly final, was screenshotted millions of times. It was printed on posters. It was turned into T-shirts. Some began calling it the new anthem of accountability. Others called it the beginning of a political reawakening, where power wasn't measured by volume, but by evidence and poise. In the weeks that followed, Jasmine's name continued to rise, not as a headline, but as a reference point. Universities began studying the case. Law schools added it to syllabi. Media professors used it to teach where ethics must override ratings. Her courtroom presence, her refusal to engage in emotional warfare, her use of process instead of personality, it all became part of something bigger. The trial had ended, but the conversation had only just begun. She hadn't destroyed a show. She hadn't canceled anyone. She had simply said no, and then proven, in front of the nation, that truth can still bring the powerful to their knees. For Jasmine, vindication didn't come from a headline. It came from something far rarer: justice in plain sight. And while others were still scrambling to reframe the narrative, she had already moved on. The empire had cracked. The apology had aired. The verdict had been read. And the world, it had heard her, clearly, without shouting, without scandal, just a suitcase full of evidence, a courtroom full of truth, and a nation forced for once to sit down, shut up, and listen. And while Jasmine Crockett walked quietly out of the courthouse, no entourage, no press conference, no victory lap, the shockwave she left behind rippled like a detonation through the entire broadcast industry. Her silence did not mute the moment, it magnified it. Within hours of the ruling, not just ABC, but every major network across the country entered crisis mode. Executives flooded production group chats, emergency Slack channels lit up, and legal departments were summoned like firefighters to a multi-alarm blaze. A dozen showrunners across New York and Los Angeles issued urgent memos to their on-air hosts. Effective immediately, all talent must review recent commentary and flag any segment involving political figures, legal disputes, or personal mockery for legal vetting. What Jasmine had done wasn't just win, it was redefine the battlefield. In one courtroom, with one verdict, she had shifted the gravity of risk. Within 24 hours, a prominent cable news channel canceled 3 of its upcoming segments labeled as explosive debates, fearing that lines blurred too close to actionable defamation. One segment, originally titled Dragging the Radicals Live, was quietly pulled from the programming lineup, its promo material scrubbed before sunrise. A producer at that network, speaking off the record, admitted bluntly, "It's not just about the view anymore. Now every mic is a potential liability." Legal firms across the country moved swiftly to capitalize. Several top-tier media law practices began drafting new compliance workshops under an urgent banner, Satire or Smear, Navigating Speech Liability in the Era of Live Broadcasting. The subtitle, What Crockett vs. ABC Teaches Us All. Registrations surged. By the end of the week, law firms from DC to Beverly Hills were offering masterclasses to news producers, podcast creators, and public figures alike. Classes that didn't exist 2 weeks ago. One senior attorney tweeted, 10 years of case law just got rewritten by one woman with a locked suitcase of receipts. And behind studio curtains, the fear was visceral. A prominent talk show host, someone who had sat comfortably in prime time for nearly 2 decades, spoke to the New York Times under condition of anonymity. His voice, usually thunderous on air, now sounded cautious. "If even Whoopi can go down," he said, "then no one's untouchable anymore." That verdict didn't just hit them, it hit all of us, hard. The line ran the next morning in bold italics beneath a stark headline, "TV's age of immunity is over." For years, media personalities believed in a kind of cultural diplomatic immunity, where apology absolved harm, where ratings insulated ethics. Jasmine had proved otherwise. Back at ABC headquarters, the fallout had turned inward. In a 4-hour closed-door internal summit, dozens of producers, executives, and legal officers gathered to dissect the trial not as a court loss, but as a corporate catastrophe. The atmosphere was clinical, brutal, and ice cold. No jokes, no justifications. Every voice was recorded. At one point, a senior vice president, normally calm, now visibly shaken, stood and addressed the room. "Let's stop blaming Crockett." She didn't outmaneuver us with emotions. We lost because we ignored warning after warning. We lost because we thought no one would dare challenge us. And then we kept poking, and she didn't flinch. She filed then, leaning into the microphone. He delivered the final cut. "We weren't beaten by a lawsuit. We shot ourselves in the foot with arrogance, and we bled out on national television." That quote leaked within minutes. Screenshots of internal emails circulated on Reddit, Discord servers, and insider journalism forums. A draft of ABC's damage control strategy titled Post-Crockett Protocol went viral overnight. It included new restrictions on improvisational banter during live shows, mandatory legal reviews for hot topic episodes, and a temporary freeze on booking political guests altogether. ABC wasn't just recovering, they were rebuilding from rubble. PR firms were dispatched like trauma surgeons. Investor calls were flooded with questions. Would stockholders sue? Would advertisers return? Would The View ever air again? And yet, through all of it, through the sudden industry-wide humility, through the revised scripts and broken egos, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. The networks filled their hours with analysis. Experts took to podcasts, calling it the trial that tamed the beast. But Jasmine didn't need to respond. She had already spoken, in affidavits, in transcripts, in airtight evidence. She had spoken without shouting, without venom, without spectacle. And what made her victory so final, so cutting, was that she never asked for revenge. She asked for respect, and the court demanded it for her. Now, as morning shows shuffled nervously through their cue cards, every segment was weighed differently. Could that joke be misread? Could that segment become a subpoena? The cameras still rolled. The sets still gleamed. But the tone had shifted. The air was cautious now, almost reverent, and for the first time in years, power no longer belonged to the one with the biggest audience or the boldest insult. It belonged to the one who brought truth to court and walked out undefeated. And as the last of the shattered broadcast giants limped from the wreckage of the verdict, the center of gravity shifted, not just in media, but in culture. What began as a legal confrontation became a watershed moment for accountability in the public square. Jasmine Crockett's name no longer belonged solely to a courtroom or a congressional district. It became a fixture in the American lexicon, a shorthand for principled resistance, for calm under fire, for fighting back not with fury, but with fact. In the weeks that followed, she wasn't just cited. She was studied, invoked, and ultimately elevated. Every major law school in the country scrambled to update its fall curriculum. Georgetown, Columbia, Stanford, each announced a dedicated seminar on Crockett vs. ABC before the ink on the verdict had even dried. Invitations poured in. She was asked to keynote at legal ethics symposiums, to testify before Senate committees on speech and liability, to appear on panel after panel, dissecting her case as a landmark in First Amendment boundaries. And while she accepted a few carefully chosen forms rooted in jurisprudence and public integrity, she turned down every entertainment invitation without hesitation. No late-night interviews, no book deals, no Netflix dramatizations. Jasmine's silence wasn't retreat, it was strategy, and it only made her victory echo louder. Time magazine didn't ask for a quote. They didn't need one. Instead, they published a stark, defiant cover. Black background, white serif text, and her face. Expressionless, steady, lit from one side like a courtroom statue. The headline read, "The Quiet Fire, Jasmine Crockett and the Day TV Learned Fear." The feature inside was not breathless hero worship. It was an autopsy of an industry, dissecting how arrogance, negligence, and hubris fell to patience, discipline, and documentation. The article's final paragraph read like a judgment carved into marble. In an era defined by outrage, she chose restraint. In a medium ruled by spectacle, she chose truth. And in a world that expected her to scream, Jasmine Crockett simply built her case and watched the empire collapse under its own weight. But the reverberations reached far beyond magazine pages and lecture halls. In Washington, Capitol Hill took note. The House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution announced an emergency hearing on media accountability, citing the Crockett case as a national teaching moment. A bipartisan coalition, something almost extinct in modern politics, called for new legislative reviews into the boundaries of defamation, retaliation, and ethical responsibility for televised commentary. During the opening session, Jasmine's trial footage was played in part as a cautionary tale, in part as legal precedent. One congressman, usually hostile to progressive causes, paused midway through his questioning to admit, "Whether you agree with her politics or not, what Crockett just did changed the rules." Period. On social media, the symbol of Jasmine transformed. Artists painted murals in D.C., Chicago, and Oakland, depicting her not with a megaphone, but with a briefcase and courtroom transcript in hand. Memes turned her into a folk legend, the attorney who never shouted, never folded, and never missed. Protesters outside media headquarters in Los Angeles began carrying signs that read, "Bring facts like Crockett," and "Not every war needs a shout." Journalists in training began referring to poorly sourced segments as Crockett bait, a quiet industry term meaning, "You'd better hope she doesn't see this." And still, Jasmine said almost nothing. She issued no manifesto. She published no open letter. But behind the silence was a growing impact that no microphone could manufacture. At Harvard Law School, Professor Marian Lasker, a legal scholar with 3 decades of Supreme Court analysis under her belt, was asked during a televised forum, "What made Jasmine Crockett different?" She didn't hesitate. She didn't win with emotion. She won with disciplined patience. The very thing television was never prepared to confront. Crockett weaponized credibility, and it terrified them. The clip went viral overnight. Meanwhile, media corporations rewrote their training materials. Major talk shows instituted 5-second delays on live tapings. Legal consultants were embedded into production rooms. It became normal to hear producers say things like, "Run it through a Crockett screen," before greenlighting any political content. ABC, still reeling from internal hemorrhaging, quietly settled 3 other lawsuits that had been looming in the shadows, eager to avoid any more public courtroom disasters. Crockett had become the new threshold. If your segment couldn't survive her standard, it didn't air. And yet, for all the frenzy, for all the national retooling and institutional repentance, Jasmine remained unfazed. In an age where victory is often accompanied by spectacle, balloons, book launches, triumphant soundbites, she refused to let the world repackage her into clickbait. Her most public post-verdict moment was an unannounced visit to a community legal aid center in Baltimore, where she delivered boxes of courtroom resources, annotated transcripts, and legal templates for underserved clients. No press, no camera crew, just an aide, 2 paralegals, and a stack of justice hard-earned. And that, more than any magazine cover, any viral quote, any panel discussion, is what cemented her place in history. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a lawsuit. She rewrote the rules of public confrontation. She proved that truth, when armed with discipline and backed by law, is not just powerful, it's indestructible. The media had mocked her, provoked her, underestimated her. But when the time came, she didn't fight fire with fire. She fought with paper, tape, transcripts, timelines, and the quiet confidence of someone who never doubted what was right. Now every newsroom has a new baseline. Every anchor has a new caution. Every executive has a new fear. And every law student has a new case to study, not just for its outcome, but for the impossible precision with which it was waged. Jasmine Crockett didn't just walk into a courtroom. She walked into an industry's blind spot and turned it into a mirror. And the reflection it cast was unmistakably hers. And even after the courtroom had emptied, the lights dimmed, and the networks rewrote their policies, the resonance of Jasmine Crockett's battle continued to ripple, quietly, powerfully, and relentlessly. It did not end with applause. It did not climax with a victory parade or self-congratulatory speech. It ended with a shift in how an entire nation viewed speech, power, and responsibility. The finality wasn't in celebration, it was in reflection. Across classrooms, newsrooms, and courtrooms, something had changed. The once unquestioned sanctity of political satire and televised sarcasm had been split open, and what emerged was not censorship, but accountability. What Jasmine had achieved without shouting, without theatrics, wasn't just justice, it was a reset. In the weeks that followed, the cultural shift hardened into an awakening. College campuses launched nationwide discussions on the limits of satire and the ethics of public commentary. At USC's School of Cinematic Arts, a panel titled Laughter, Libel, and the Line drew an audience that spilled into hallways. Ivy League classrooms updated lecture slides with Crockett's testimony as the new defining precedent for retaliation in media. What used to be shrugged off as just a joke was now dissected with legal scrutiny. Students, professors, and media theorists began to reframe the very premise of harmless humor. And beneath it all, an urgent question began echoing through digital headlines and think pieces. When does a punchline become a weapon? The shift was not just academic, it was emotional. Survivors of online smear campaigns, whistleblowers mocked in the press, and private citizens ridiculed by viral moments now found in Jasmine a silent champion. She had turned humiliation into litigation, and she had won. Her case, once dismissed by skeptics as career suicide, had become the North Star for anyone silenced by spectacle. Across social media, thousands began sharing the phrase now immortalized by her courtroom demeanor. Don't scream, don't shrink, document. But the crescendo came not in a courtroom or on a cable segment, but at the Global Media Ethics Conference in Geneva, a gathering of the world's most decorated journalists, broadcasters, and legal analysts, each eager to reframe what responsibility meant in the age of virality. On the third day of the summit, in the marble-lined auditorium of Palais des Nations, a media scholar from the University of Copenhagen took the podium. She carried no slides, no video, just a printout of a quote that had begun to circle the world like a signal fire. With a pause, she read aloud, "When a show mocks you, look straight into the camera. When they clip it and post it, take them to court." The auditorium went silent, and in that stillness, something profound took hold. The words weren't defiant, they were clear, not vengeance, not anger, just a statement of line, of consequence, of earned reckoning. The quote spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, it was printed on protest signs, painted on murals in Brooklyn, screen printed on tote bags at Columbia Law. On X, formerly Twitter, it became a viral header image with millions of shares. The phrase did not preach revolution, it demanded dignity. For decades, the line between comedy and cruelty had been blurry by design. Now, thanks to one woman's methodical refusal to be reduced to a punchline, that line had definition. Late-night writers, once untouchable in their sarcasm, now consulted in-house attorneys before targeting political figures. Media watchdogs expanded their scope from newsrooms to entertainment studios. Suddenly, shows that had long prided themselves on their edgy irreverence found themselves revisiting old footage with panic and regret. It wasn't censorship, it was consequences. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett did not gloat. She made no victory lap. Her public appearances remained limited and deliberate. Law symposiums, congressional hearings, and civic education forums. When approached for book deals, she declined. When invited to reappear on major networks, some even offering special apology town halls, she simply replied, "My work speaks for itself. I don't need a stage. I had a courtroom." In private legal circles, she became the subject of hushed admiration. Senior partners began citing her case as a model of how to win without spectacle. Law professors praised her courtroom demeanor as evidence incarnate. And in the minds of the public, Jasmine's image morphed into something rare and enduring. Not a celebrity, but a standard. The kind you measure policy against. The kind you invoke when telling someone to stand their ground. For journalists with integrity, she became a moral compass. For entertainers who once blurred fact and fiction, she became a cautionary tale. And for citizens everywhere who had been mocked, discredited, or ridiculed in the name of ratings, she became proof that the law still had teeth and the truth still had power. And so, the story ended not with cheers, but with change. Not with fireworks, but with guidelines. Not with noise, but with silence. Firm, principled silence. The media no longer laughed quite so carelessly. The public no longer watched quite so passively. And the law, once considered too slow to catch up with the pace of broadcast slander, had finally caught up and then raced ahead. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., long after the headlines had cooled and the cameras pointed elsewhere, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her office, finalizing new language for a bill to expand protections for victims of retaliatory media attacks. She signed it with a pen gifted by a young law student who had skipped graduation just to attend her trial. The pen was engraved with a single phrase: "Not every truth needs a microphone. Some just need a record." And in that quiet, deliberate motion, Jasmine Crockett didn't just close a chapter. She started a movement. As the echo of Jasmine Crockett's victory settled across courtrooms, newsrooms, and legislative halls, something even more profound began to unfold beneath the surface. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was irreversible. The media industry, long addicted to provocation and protected by parody, began to shiver under the weight of its own reflection. The networks that once turned conflict into currency now found themselves re-examining every segment, every monologue, every supposed zinger. The lawsuits weren't flying yet, but the fear was real. In writers' rooms from Manhattan to Hollywood, producers scribbled furiously on whiteboards under new mandates: fact-check jokes, tone down sarcasm, run legal review first. It was no longer enough to be clever. Now they had to be correct. What Jasmine sparked wasn't a crackdown. It was a recalibration. Showrunners held emergency summits on defamation risk mitigation, a phrase that had once been relegated to the bottom of email chains. Satirical late-night programs that once thrived on ridicule began consulting with legal counsel before final cuts. Segments titled Clown of the Week or Mock the Madness were either rebranded or retired entirely. Networks weren't just afraid of another lawsuit, they were afraid of another Jasmine. A woman who didn't scream, didn't flinch, and didn't fold. A woman who used the very rules the industry ignored to write a verdict that would live longer than any punchline. In editorial meetings at major publications, editors reminded their columnists, "We're not above the law. The court just reminded us of that." Even podcast hosts, the new frontier of unfettered speech, issued internal memos to their teams clarifying the boundaries between opinion, humor, and actionable harm. The ripple effect wasn't just legal, it was moral. And at the center of it stood Jasmine Crockett, not seeking revenge, but reminding a country that had confused cruelty with commentary that the microphone is not a shield. It's a responsibility. And yet, even in her silence, Jasmine was everywhere. Her case became a reference in journalism schools, a citation in legal briefs, a conversation starter in corporate boardrooms. Talk show panels began referencing her name with hesitation, almost reverence. Lawmakers quoted her strategy during hearings about reforming speech protections. She had become what no satirical host had ever predicted, a legal landmark in human form. And still, she gave no speeches, no interviews, no memoirs, just presence. And its weight was undeniable. And then came the moment the cameras had been waiting for. Outside the courthouse, as the media assembled in force, a corridor of flashing bulbs and whirring lenses stretched like a canyon of judgment. Journalists elbowed for position. Commentators rehearsed their questions. But Jasmine Crockett emerged not as a triumphant celebrity, nor as a vengeful victor. She emerged as a reckoning. She stepped onto the granite steps of the courthouse with slow precision, flanked not by bodyguards but by silence. No smile, no wave, no victory sign. Just a locked expression of control, a message, not a moment. Dozens of reporters shouted questions. None were answered. Instead, she paused halfway down the steps, facing the sea of cameras. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't clear her throat. She simply looked. A stillness that pierced through static. A gaze that said everything a press release never could. And then, as the bulbs flickered and the mics trembled, She uttered the only sentence she had prepared. Not rehearsed, not market-tested, just lived. I didn't come here to be famous. I came to remind them, when words are sharp enough, they cut like actions, and should cost just as much. She turned, walked. No handlers, no music swell. The echo of her heels on the stone steps cut sharper than any verdict. And just like that, the image was immortalized. Jasmine Crockett, back turned to power, walking away from fame, and toward the next fight the world didn't yet know it needed. The story didn't end there. It didn't need to. The world had already taken its note, and the cameras kept rolling. But this time, they listened. But as the cameras faded and the world moved on to its next scandal, what remained wasn't just legal precedent, it was a moral bruise on the conscience of a nation. This wasn't about celebrity or ratings anymore. It was about the line between power and cruelty, and what happens when someone finally dares to draw it. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a courtroom war. She reminded America of something it had forgotten in its hunger for spectacle. That human dignity is not collateral for laughs. That silence, when rooted in truth, can speak louder than any monologue. That no title, comedian, anchor, or executive, justifies mockery disguised as commentary. She showed the world that accountability doesn't need a spotlight to be devastating. It only needs patience. And when injustice becomes routine, discipline becomes the sharpest weapon. In the end, Jasmine taught us all, justice isn't about crushing the loudest voice. It's about protecting the quiet ones who dare to stand. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. At 7:52 a.m., before the sun even rose over Washington, D.C., Jasmine Crockett walked into a live studio where 17 million would soon witness history. Face to face with Clint Eastwood, a legend twice her age, ready to silence her with one cold stare. The topic? Public education versus prison funding. A battle of values, power, and whose America gets to speak. But within 90 seconds, the tone shifted. Her voice didn't rise, but the room stopped breathing. As cameras rolled and producers whispered, one sentence from Jasmine shattered decades of silence. In Clint's composure. What could one woman say on live TV that left a Hollywood icon completely undone? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lights in Studio 6B roared to life long before the sun crept over Dallas. Their heat fell hard and unrelenting, bouncing off white floors and chrome chairs like interrogation lamps. Producers hovered near the monitors, whispering in clipped tones. "Keep it controlled," one said sharply. "Last month's segment ended in shouting and cost us a sponsor." The air smelled like coffee, hairspray, and quiet dread. The script called this a balanced conversation, but the staff knew better. This wasn't a discussion. It was a detonation waiting for the first spark. Jasmine Crockett entered like a verdict. She didn't stride. She arrived. Blazer dark as midnight, crisp and severe. On her collar, a gold pin caught the light. VOTE. She didn't scan the room for approval. Her gaze cut clean through it, weighing, measuring. When an assistant chirped nervously, "Can I get you water?" "Coffee." She shook her head, sat down, crossed one leg over the other, and asked, "Do you have the last 5 years of Department of Education budget breakdowns? I want to verify the federal to state ratio before we go live." No small talk. No smile. She came prepared for a fight no one else had even rehearsed. Minutes later, Clint Eastwood stepped onto the set. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His arrival was a presence, not a performance. He wore a worn charcoal jacket, the kind with history stitched into every crease. He paused for no one, ignored the powder brush offered by makeup, and took his place with the stillness of an old gunslinger eyeing a distant horizon. The shadow he cast stretched long and hard behind him, slicing the floor like a memory of some black and white war he once filmed, and maybe still thought he was in. They didn't exchange a glance. They didn't speak. But across the wide arc of the studio table, two worlds settled into position. Jasmine, young, sharp, alert. Clint, unshaken, seasoned, unyielding. A silence more deafening than applause settled over the room. It wasn't peace. It was pressure. And everyone watching knew it. History was about to break through the screen. The silence hung for a moment longer, sharp and weighted, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Then, like a knife slipping beneath the skin, Raymond's voice entered, polite, measured, designed to diffuse what everyone already knew was coming. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, glancing briefly between his cue card and the woman sitting straight back across from Clint Eastwood. "You've suggested that a sizable portion of federal prison funding should be reallocated toward education and school infrastructure. Some say that's unrealistic. Others go further, calling it, frankly, idealistic. How do you respond to that?" Jasmine didn't even look at Raymond. Her eyes remained fixed slightly past the camera, like she was speaking to someone beyond the lights. Someone who lived this. Her tone was calm, but it carried a tension beneath it, like piano wire pulled taut. "People call it idealism," she began, "because they have never stood in a public school hallway that smells like mildew and broken air conditioning." She turned her head slightly, just enough to make sure Clint could hear it all. "They've never opened a math book held together with duct tape or watched a substitute teacher cry in the parking lot because she's been covering a classroom for 8 weeks without a contract. They call it a dream," she said, voice dipping lower, slower, "because their reality is insulated by wealth and comfort. But for millions of kids, especially black, brown, and poor kids, this country's priorities are a nightmare." She leaned forward slightly. Her eyes didn't waver. "3 weeks ago, I visited a school in Beaumont. 3rd grade classroom, 32 students, 1 teacher, no teaching aide. Their science materials? A decade old. They're learning about climate change with a globe that still shows the USSR. And when I asked what they needed most, the teacher said, to not have to buy glue sticks with my own money." She paused, letting it hang in the air like a verdict. "And yet, this government has a budget that spends 3 times more per prisoner than per pupil." Her fingers tapped once, sharp against the table. "That's not policy. That's pathology." The studio was dead still now. No one shifted. No one looked at their phones. Jasmine's voice was steady, but it carried the heat of someone who had lived too long with polite silence. "When I say we should move money from mass incarceration to public education, I'm not dreaming. I'm reacting. Reacting to a country that built pipelines from school to prison so efficiently it didn't even need blueprints. I've met 12-year-olds suspended for rolling their eyes at underpaid security guards. Meanwhile, billionaire tax cheats get book deals and beachfront homes." She inhaled slowly. "Idealism is believing we can keep funding punishment and still call ourselves just. What I'm suggesting? That's not utopia. That's triage." Raymond looked stunned, momentarily forgetting the next question. In the control room, a producer whispered, "We need to clip that for the highlights." That was the moment. But inside the studio, no one was thinking about ratings. Clint Eastwood hadn't moved. His arms were crossed, his jaw clenched, but his posture had shifted by half an inch, just enough for those watching closely to notice. Jasmine didn't stop. Her words sharpened. "You know what's unrealistic, Raymond? Expecting a child who's hungry, ignored, and under-resourced to grow up and respect a system that never invested in them. You want lower crime? Invest before the crime happens? You want discipline? Start by showing dignity. Because what I've seen, what I've lived, isn't some lofty dream. It's a slow bleed of a broken promise, and I'm here to cauterize it." The moment settled like embers in dry grass, still, glowing, waiting, until Jasmine leaned in once more, her voice tightening like a wire about to snap. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. Her calm carried a sharper edge than any shout ever could. "There's a school in my district that shut down for 10 days straight last summer," she began, her words crisp, deliberate. "Mid-July, heat index soaring over 108. The air conditioning system failed. Old, neglected, patched together for years with duct tape and wishful thinking. Classrooms became ovens. A boy had a nosebleed at his desk. A girl fainted during homeroom. The nurse was overwhelmed. They sent kids home with handwritten notes saying, "We'll try again when it cools down." She paused, but not to breathe. She paused so the shame could land. Her eyes shifted slightly toward Clint, but her focus remained razor thin. "Now let me paint the other side of the street, literally, not metaphorically, just across the road. Crescent Hills Prep. Tuition? $28,000 a year. Their HVAC system is automated by sensor. Their floors are marble. Their gymnasium has filtered water dispensers every 15 feet. They never closed. Not once. While public school children baked in unlivable heat, Crescent Hills students were reviewing summer enrichment packets in chilled classrooms under skylights." She turned back to the camera. "Don't talk to me about equality if 2 zip codes can determine whether a child gets air or heat stroke." The room had gone so quiet the audience could hear the soft hiss of a light buzzing overhead. Jasmine didn't blink. "I've heard people say, well, that's unfortunate." "No, a fallen tree during a storm is unfortunate. This isn't a storm, it's design. The system isn't broken. It was engineered meticulously to privilege those with while rationing survival to those without. It's not some abstract flaw. It's policy. It's zoning. It's history that still lives in building codes and bond measures and school board meetings where voices like mine were never invited." She leaned slightly forward, her palms now pressed gently to the desk, steady as a surgeon about to cut deep. "And when I say shift funding from mass incarceration to public education, I'm not making a moral plea. I'm demanding that we stop treating children like liabilities until they become threats. You want to prevent crime?" She tapped her finger once. "Cool their classrooms. Feed them. Give them updated books and teachers who don't burn out by October. That's not charity, that's common sense." Clint sat motionless, arms crossed, his face unreadable, but the stiffness in his jaw gave him away. He let the silence stretch, perhaps out of confidence, perhaps out of calculation. And then, in a voice aged with grit and smoke, he fired back. "Compassion is admirable," he said flatly, "but it doesn't build civilizations. The founding fathers didn't build this country with emotions. They built it with rules, with law, with discipline." His tone never shifted. To him, that was final. Jasmine didn't answer immediately. She tilted her head just slightly, and then, just the faintest curl of a smile, sharp as broken glass. "Maybe they didn't cry," she said softly, her voice like a scalpel against stone. "But I doubt they skipped dinner because their mother had to choose between the electric bill and groceries." Her eyes locked onto his. "I doubt they learned to read in a room where mold grew above the blackboard and rats chewed through the construction paper on the bulletin boards." She exhaled, not to calm herself but to clear space for what was next. "You speak of order like it was handed down from the mountaintop, but for millions of us, there was no order, only survival. You speak of discipline, I speak of dignity, and the difference between the two is whether you've ever had to earn your place at a table that wasn't built for you." Nobody moved, not Clint, not the audience, not even the cameraman whose lens had been trained on her without blinking. In that moment, the room didn't just hear her, they felt her. And it wasn't idealism, it was indictment, burned into every syllable. The tension hadn't yet settled from Jasmine's searing indictment when Raymond, sensing the room tilting towards something raw and unscripted, tried to thread it back to safer ground. He leaned forward with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and said, "Let me ask both of you this. How do we bridge the generational divide? The one between those who built this country and those now pushing to reshape it." His voice was smooth, almost hopeful, but there was a tremble just beneath it, a crack in the moderator's composure that even the studio lights couldn't burn away. The question was meant to neutralize, to reset the emotional weight in the room. Instead, it detonated the next phase of collision. Clint Eastwood didn't blink. He turned his body a fraction, not fully toward Jasmine, but no longer away. His hands folded slowly across his chest, knuckles pale under the pressure. Then he spoke, and his voice was no longer grandfatherly. It was cutting, measured, dangerous. "You don't bridge generations," he said, "by tearing down what came before you." The sentence rang out like the opening line of a closing argument. Too many of these new voices, he went on, his tone tightening with every word, aren't interested in understanding the past. They're rewriting it, discarding it, like wisdom has an expiration date, or like history was written just to offend them. His fingers drummed once against the desk, slow, almost disdainful. Real leadership, he said, voice gaining that signature Eastwood grit, isn't something you earn by trending online. It doesn't come from hashtags, or hashtags pretending to be movements. It doesn't come from slogans on cardboard signs waved between selfies. The audience was still, not because they agreed, but because the temperature in the room had changed. He wasn't just answering the question, he was carving a target into it. Leadership, he continued, comes from knowing when to step back, when to stay quiet, when to do the damn work without turning it into theater. He leaned forward just slightly now, the lights carving harsh shadows beneath his brow. That's what the founders understood. Duty, not noise. Strength, not sensitivity. Discipline, not drama. And then, like a blade drawn with intent, he let the final words drop with slow venom. Especially from those trying to turn politics into performance, particularly the women who think this is their game now. Trying to play a man's game like they invented struggle yesterday. The silence that followed wasn't shocked. It was surgical, deliberate. Even the oxygen in the room seemed to retreat. One of the stage hands in the wings dropped a headset, and the crack of plastic against concrete sounded like glass breaking in a mausoleum. A member of the camera crew instinctively adjusted his focus, but didn't dare breathe. Inside the control booth, no one spoke. No one cued commercial. No one touched a single dial. In that instant, Clint didn't just speak from another era. He weaponized it. He had drawn a line, not with facts, not even with debate, but with the kind of coded arrogance that didn't need to shout to humiliate. He didn't need to look directly at Jasmine. The line had already found her. It was the line women like her had heard their entire lives, wrapped in condescension, dressed as order, delivered like truth. And yet across from him sat a woman who had heard worse in silence, in courtrooms, in boardrooms, and in campaign stops where hands lingered too long on her back. She wasn't stunned. She was steel. But for the briefest moment, the entire studio froze, balanced perfectly on the edge of something unspoken, something heavy, something irreparable. The moment Clint believed he'd reasserted control was the moment the room began to turn. Clint's final words sat in the center of the room like a lit fuse, crackling, deliberate, unchallenged for now. But Jasmine didn't rush to reply. She inhaled slowly, held the silence in her lungs, and let it stretch. 5 seconds, then 6. On the 7th second, she moved, not with outrage, not with showmanship, but with clarity that cut colder than fury ever could. She didn't lean forward. She didn't lift her voice. She simply turned her gaze toward Clint and said almost gently, "You think I'm performing?" The words floated across the table like smoke before a fire. Calm, clean, deadly. The camera zoomed in slightly. The air around her seemed to still. "You think this is an audition?" she asked, her voice so soft the microphones almost missed the first syllable. "You think I showed up today to be seen? I've spent most of my life trying to not be seen the wrong way, trying to prove I belong in rooms where I was expected to fail quietly." Her eyes didn't flinch. "You can afford to think this is theater. I can't, because where I come from, if you hesitate, someone else speaks over you. If you speak too soon, they say you're emotional. And if you don't speak at all, they erase you like you were never there." She exhaled once, slow, surgical. "My mother was a nurse in South Dallas. She worked night shifts at a county hospital for 18 years. Not a glamorous clinic, a trauma center, blood, screams, no budget. She worked so much we only saw her face at 6 a.m., when her scrubs still smelled like antiseptic and fatigue. One night, she collapsed in the break room bathroom. Her body just gave out. They found her on the tile floor with her ID badge pressed into her neck. She didn't go home. She didn't call in. She finished her shift. She took a 2-hour nap in her car and walked back into that building to check vitals for patients who didn't know her name. That's the kind of woman who raised me." Her hands were still folded, her posture unmoved. But the edge in her voice had crystallized. You want to talk about sacrifice? She continued, now barely louder than a whisper but twice as sharp. Sacrifice isn't writing your name on a statue. It's being too tired to stand but showing up anyway, because no one else will. It's holding broken systems together with your bare hands, while people who've never set foot in your world tell you to be grateful. She let the silence breathe again, but now it was the silence of command, not reaction. Then her voice shifted, lower, deeper. There was a boy I represented once, 12 years old, first generation, smart, too smart. He asked his seventh grade teacher why Black history only got 3 pages in the textbook. He asked, why don't we talk about anything that happened after Martin Luther King died? He didn't yell. He didn't insult. He asked a question. Her lips pressed into a line for a moment. The school called it defiance. They called his curiosity a disruption. They suspended him. 3 days. I met him when his mother called my office in tears. They didn't see a curious child. They saw a future threat. That's what it means to be judged before you grow. Her focus now locked fully on Clint, her voice steady, but hardening like stone in slow freeze. So no, I'm not performing, I'm surviving. Every word I say on this stage is one I've calculated, one I've earned, because if I slip, even for a moment, it doesn't just cost me, it costs the people I speak for, the ones who never get invited to this table, the ones who are told to be grateful for crumbs while others inherit the feast. She held the pause just long enough to make the entire room sit in it. And then softly, this is not a performance. This is the consequence of being real in a world that rewards pretending you don't see what's broken. The lights didn't flicker. The cameras didn't pan. But the mood shifted, like a fault line had quietly cracked beneath the floor. The silence following Jasmine's last statement still lingered in the studio air. Dense, unmoving. When Clint leaned forward, clearing his throat with a soft, deliberate rasp that felt more like warning than reflex. His voice was steady, but the tone had shifted. Not defensive, not shaken. Just colder, more brittle. The way glass sounds right before it shatters. Look, he said, I respect anyone willing to serve this country. I do. He nodded once, as if offering her a gesture of civility before slamming the door behind it. But don't turn service into spectacle. Don't turn politics into a stage for emotional monologues. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He had perfected the art of belittlement wrapped in discipline, of dressing condescension as concern. He continued, his fingers tightening on the edge of the desk, jaw set. Politics used to be about facts, numbers, proposals. Now it's feelings. Everyone's trying to out-trauma each other. We used to solve problems. Now we narrate them. And somehow that's supposed to be leadership. His gaze flicked toward Jasmine, sharp but controlled. Feelings don't build bridges, he said, and hashtags don't pass laws. Discipline does, knowing when to do the work and when to stay quiet. Then came the last line, as if loaded and saved for the moment he wanted to draw real blood, especially for those trying to force their way into arenas they weren't built for. People who mistake microphones for merit. A pause. Particularly the women who think loudness equals leadership. The words didn't explode. They slid like poison under the skin. Quiet, invasive, deadly. For a beat, the entire set seemed to falter. Not a sound, not a shift. Even the lighting felt sharper, harsher, like the air itself had gone brittle with tension. In the control booth, a producer's hand froze above the cut-to-break button. A stage hand near the camera clutched the corner of a cue card so tightly it crinkled audibly. Everyone knew they'd crossed into something deeper than debate, into the territory where power no longer hides behind language, but weaponizes it. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't raise a brow, didn't shift in her chair, didn't even blink more than once. She let Clint's words hang in the air like smoke from a spent cartridge. Then, with a calm that didn't ask for silence but commanded it, she spoke. Her voice didn't rise. It sank deeper. I don't confuse loudness with being right, she said, her words slow and deliberate, like she was placing them one by one on a scale of history. But I also know this. Silence has never saved people who look like me. She paused, not for drama, but for truth to settle into the bones of the room. It didn't save us when they closed schools instead of fixing them. It didn't save us when our communities were over-policed and underfunded. It didn't save us when we buried loved ones whose names never made the news. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus, like a surgeon before the incision. Silence, she said again, lower this time, is what people like me have been told to master while watching others mistake comfort for courage. And then, without shifting tone, volume, or posture, she delivered the line that would be etched into headlines, textbooks, TikToks, and late-night segments for years to come. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet somehow louder than anything else that had been said. Maybe I'm not too much. Maybe you've been too little for too long. No one moved. No one reacted. The oxygen seemed to leave the room, not with force, but with precision, like someone had sealed every vent. The audience didn't gasp. They didn't applaud. They froze. Raymond sat motionless, his hands still resting on the desk but visibly clenched. Clint's face was unreadable, but something behind his eyes flickered. Recognition, perhaps, or the slow realization that control had quietly slipped from his grasp. In that moment, it wasn't about who was louder or sharper. It wasn't even about politics anymore. It was about the fault line that had finally, undeniably split right down the center of the American conversation. And Jasmine Crockett, without raising her voice, had just drawn the line in permanent ink. The room was paralyzed in silence, but Jasmine didn't pause to enjoy it. She didn't need the moment to catch up to her. She owned it now, not with volume, but with velocity. And so, for the first time, she turned her body toward the center camera. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the gesture carried weight, because this wasn't for Clint anymore. It wasn't for Raymond, the studio, or the thousands watching live. It was for the one person whose voice hadn't been invited into the room. Jasmine's gaze locked into the lens, her face calm, almost maternal. But beneath that calm, there was iron. "There is a little girl watching this right now," she said, her voice soft, slow, yet unshakably firm. "I don't know her name. I don't know where she is. But I know what she's been told, because I was told the same things." She let the air stretch, her tone never wavering. "She's been told she's too loud, too emotional, that her questions are disruptive. She's been told that her leadership makes people uncomfortable, and that her ambition needs to be adjusted. Not because she's wrong, but because her presence makes others feel small." Jasmine's eyes didn't blink. Maybe she's sitting in a classroom right now, raising her hand for the 5th time and watching her teacher choose someone else. Maybe she's on a debate team where she's the only black girl, and when she speaks with force, they call it aggression instead of intellect. Maybe she's at home, watching this from behind a cracked phone screen while someone in the next room tells her to keep it down. A slight breath. "I want to tell her, no, I need to tell her, you are not wrong." Her voice dipped into something deeper now, not a register of sound, but of memory. "I was that girl. I know what it feels like to carry brilliance in a room that only wants your silence, to have truth burning inside you while adults, principals, deans, politicians look through you like furniture." Her hands remained still, fingers lightly clasped on the table before her. "And I remember every time I lowered my voice to fit the room, every time I edited myself for someone else's comfort. I remember the weight of that disguise, how heavy it became, and I remember the exact moment I dropped it." The studio remained frozen, and yet the atmosphere shifted. Less like a performance, more like an altar had been built in plain sight. "There are generations of women who never made it to these microphones," Jasmine continued, her voice now filled with quiet reverence. "Women who organized campaigns but were never given credit. Women who drafted policy on yellow legal pads in basements, while men took the podium upstairs. Women who outperformed every man in the room and were still called unlikable." She didn't tear up. She didn't tremble. She carried their memory like a shield. We are taught to believe that power comes with permission, that if we wait our turn, speak softly, and smile often enough, we'll be let in. But the truth is, doors like these weren't built for us. We had to build our own keys. Then came the pause, a breath, a silence so complete it demanded reverence. And then she said it, not as a slogan, not as a flourish, but as a contract with every girl on the other side of that screen. If even one girl, just one, hears this and realizes that standing up doesn't make her wrong, then every second of this debate was worth it. The lights didn't dim. The cameras didn't cut. But in that moment, something unspoken cracked open, not in the studio, but in the hearts of those watching. Because she hadn't just spoken to that girl. She had named her. She had freed her. As Jasmine's final words left the studio wrapped in steel and purpose, the moment didn't end. It detonated. And by the time the cameras powered down, the real storm had already begun to spread far beyond those walls. It started with a clip, 29 seconds. Low resolution, clipped by a junior intern on a borrowed editing station before the show had even wrapped. It caught Jasmine's calm gaze into the camera, the sentence that had landed like thunder in a locked room. Maybe I'm not too much. Maybe you've been too little for too long. Within minutes, it was posted to Twitter with a caption that read simply, "She didn't raise her voice, she raised the bar." 5,000 shares, then 20, then trending. A side-by-side TikTok was next. Jasmine's face on the left, a wide shot of Clint Eastwood blinking on the right, captioned, "The old guard just got audited." It hit 300,000 likes before lunch on the West Coast. By sundown, a YouTube reel had surfaced with edits cut to music, violins swelling, her words subtitled in bold white font. 72 hours later, the soundbite was being remixed over protest montages, gym workouts, and even makeup tutorials. But beneath the virality, something deeper was unfolding, a reckoning. By nightfall, America's media war rooms had deployed. On CNN, Jasmine was framed as the voice of a rising generation, a woman who had challenged legacy with composure, weaponized truth without shouting. They invited civil rights scholars, young activists, a former education secretary who said, what she did wasn't disrespect. It was necessary. On MSNBC, a host played the moment in full, then simply said, if you're more uncomfortable with her tone than his message, you're not ready for equity. Meanwhile, over on Fox News, the same clip ran, but slowed down, flattened, stripped of its heat and context. The Chiron read, Crockett embarrasses herself in live meltdown, disrespects national icon. They cut off her quote halfway, right before the word dignity. A guest panelist, face flushed and shaking his head, said, this is what happens when we trade statesmanship for social media points. The host nodded solemnly, as if Jasmine had just personally dismantled the Lincoln Memorial. The divide wasn't just visible, it was surgical. One nation, split across channels, interpreting the same 30 seconds as either a declaration of war or a long overdue release. The New York Times published an op-ed titled, When Respect Meets Resistance, while the Daily Caller countered with the death of civility in a hashtag age. In both articles, her face was everywhere. Some still images capturing the precision of her glare, others frozen mid-sentence, framed as if she'd shouted when she hadn't even raised her voice. On Reddit, a thread titled, Did Jasmine Just End Clint Eastwood's Public Persona? Gained 15,000 upvotes in 2 hours. The top comment read, She didn't destroy him. She exposed the scaffolding. A reply underneath said, She was everything they told me to never be, and that's why it worked. But the backlash came with venom. On conservative forums, her inbox was doxxed. A political cartoon circulated, showing her as a puppet held by radical youth. Someone even launched a parody account mocking her as Senator Screech. A few right-wing influencers demanded her resignation. She should apologize to Clint Eastwood right now. One man thundered on a podcast titled American Manhood Reborn. He ranted for 40 minutes. Jasmine's actual segment had been under 7. The irony was lost on him. And yet, beneath the digital noise, beneath the arguments and algorithms, was a quieter storm, a shift. Women began filming themselves reading Jasmine's quote aloud in their native languages, Spanish, Korean, Swahili, Urdu. A librarian in Boston posted a photo of her daughter taping the words to her mirror. A high school debate coach in Nebraska emailed her team, We're opening with this next week. No edits, no commentary, just her voice. Meanwhile, back in the Capitol, Jasmine's phone never stopped vibrating. Not with trolls, but with quiet texts. Thank you. I saw myself in you. I've waited a decade to hear someone say that out loud. She hadn't planned to become a symbol. She didn't rehearse for it. She simply answered a man who thought silence was strength, and in doing so, shattered the illusion that discipline belongs to one gender, one generation, or one type of voice. And now that voice, her voice, was everywhere. Not because it shouted, but because it didn't flinch. Because it held the line. And because in 30 unassuming seconds, it made millions ask a question they weren't ready for. Why are we so threatened by a woman who speaks without asking first? While Jasmine's words rippled like aftershocks across a fractured nation, Clint Eastwood, silent until now, decided to reclaim the spotlight, not with apology, but with something colder. Revision. It was 24 hours after the now viral interview, and the temperature across American discourse hadn't cooled. It had calcified. That night, Clint Eastwood appeared on The American Hour, a primetime show known for soft landings and reverent nostalgia. The studio backdrop behind him was a sepia-toned American flag, fluttering gently in digital wind. He entered wearing the same jacket from the panel, charcoal gray, rigid, unreconstructed. The host, Jack Barton, welcomed him like an old general returning from battle. "It's good to see you, sir," Jack said, his voice warm, measured, reverent. "We know you've been through quite a whirlwind the past 24 hours. Clint nodded once, almost dismissively. He didn't smile. He rarely did, especially when he believed he was under siege. The show cut to a montage, a spliced-together reel of Jasmine's most quoted line played next to online reactions, alternating between adoring praise and harsh critique. Then Jack leaned forward and asked the question America had been waiting to hear. "Some people say your comments yesterday were out of step, that they were dismissive, especially toward women in leadership. Do you feel in hindsight that maybe you went too far?" The air on set tightened. Clint stared at the desk for a moment, then looked up, not with humility, but with the slow burn of someone doubling down. "No," he said flatly. "I said what a lot of people are thinking, but don't have the guts to say on television." He paused, letting the words hang like smoke over a battlefield. "I'm not here to apologize for speaking plainly. We've got too many politicians trying to win sympathy, not respect. That's not leadership. It's performance. And I wasn't raised to reward performance." The clip hit Twitter within 3 minutes. By 5, it was on TikTok with a caption that read, "Gaslighting 101, old power won't let go." The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Thousands of young users reposted the clip side by side, with footage of women being interrupted in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in Senate chambers. A psychologist stitched the segment with commentary on defensive narcissism and generational fragility. The phrase, "I said what many think," exploded across timelines, not as a defense, but as an indictment. One user tweeted, translation, "I miss the days when I could be casually sexist without trending by breakfast." But the firestorm wasn't just digital. It reignited every wound the original moment had opened. Jasmine, who had remained silent since the panel, suddenly found herself cast again, not by her own words, but by Clint's revision of them. He didn't address her name. He didn't mention the quote that had stopped the country. He reframed it all, himself as the rational voice, her as a spark plug of emotion, the moment as an overreaction by an overactive generation. He didn't rebut what she said. He erased why she said it. On MSNBC, a political strategist called it a masterclass in manufactured dismissal. On Fox News, the panel praised his stoicism. One host declared, "Clint Eastwood reminded us tonight what real masculinity looks like, unapologetic." But to millions online, the image of a man sitting under stage lights, calmly rewriting the story he started, was anything but masculine. It was haunting. It was familiar. It was the exact dynamic Jasmine had warned against. Power masquerading as reason, dominance disguised as decorum. The quote itself mutated into a symbol. Protest signs began appearing. "I said what many are thinking, so you weren't supposed to hear us think it aloud." Editorial cartoons drew Clint sitting in front of a fireplace, his mouth open, but Jasmine's words coming out. The Atlantic published a full-page feature titled, "When Erasure Poses as Clarity." Underneath it, a single pull quote, "He didn't answer her. He removed her from the scene." And through it all, Jasmine remained silent. No rebuttal, no soundbite, no tweet. Her team declined interviews. Her official pages posted nothing. But the silence didn't feel like surrender. It felt tactical. Because while Clint tried to reshape the past with a single quote, the world had already moved on without him. His words landed like an echo in a room that was no longer listening. The world wasn't interested in what was once permitted. It was watching what had been exposed. Back on the American Hour, the interview ended with polite applause, the kind that comes from obligation, not conviction. Clint left the set to quiet handshakes and whispered thank yous. But no one called it a moment, because everyone, on every side, could feel it. This wasn't a man defending truth. It was a man trying to make the truth smaller than it had become. And truth, once spoken without apology, never fits back into the box built to silence it. While Clint attempted to recast the moment from a polished studio chair, the world outside his frame had already taken Jasmine's words, held them up to the light, and begun setting them on fire. It started like a spark in dry grass, quiet, sudden, impossible to contain. A 21-year-old marketing assistant in Atlanta uploaded a selfie-style video at 2:03 a.m. No ring light, no background music, just her face, tear-streaked but steady. "Last year," she whispered, "my boss told me I was too assertive in meetings. I believed him. I stopped talking. I started shrinking." She inhaled shakily. "Then I saw Jasmine Crockett look into that camera and say, 'Maybe I'm not too much.' And I realized, maybe I'm not either." The caption read, "I won't shrink again." Within 12 hours, the clip had over 2 million views. By nightfall, there were hundreds more like it. Young women across the country, black, brown, white, first-gen, queer, immigrant, posting raw, unedited testimonies. Confessions turned into declarations. Apologies transformed into vows. On TikTok, the movement found its visual language. One trend showed women standing in boardrooms, classroom doors, kitchens, and courthouse steps, each mouthing Jasmine's now iconic words, "I don't get to perform, I live this." Another featured women removing metaphorical masks, cutting out phrases like, "I'm just lucky to be here," and "sorry for interrupting," before lip-syncing her closer. This isn't theater, it's survival. The soundbite became a trending audio under the title, "Not Too Much," and the hashtag #SpeakLikeCrockett hit 10 million uses in under 3 days. But it wasn't just social media, it was ripple turning to current. Podcasts released emergency episodes within 48 hours of the panel. A popular series called Body Politics dropped a 90-minute breakdown titled "Tone versus Truth: What Jasmine Crockett Just Did to American Discourse." Hosts analyzed every frame, how Jasmine's hands remained folded even as her words drew blood, how her eyes never once flinched under pressure, how her silence felt louder than her sentences. They called it a master class in composure under calculated attack. One linguist joined a separate roundtable and spoke about the deliberate cadence of her delivery, how she chose not to spike her voice or soften it, but instead sat squarely in the register of power that wasn't seeking approval. Vloggers weighed in too. A popular Gen Z creator known as @AvaUnfiltered uploaded a video titled, "Why Jasmine Crockett Made Me Unapologetic Overnight." In it, she played the entire 7-second pause before Jasmine responded to Clint, saying, "Do you feel that? That silence? That's a woman deciding not to flinch when the world expects her to." The comments beneath exploded with stories. "I was told to be less passionate in law school. I was the only girl in my tech firm and learned to whisper in meetings. I needed this. I needed her." And then came the classroom. In a public high school in Cincinnati, Miss Eleanor Medina, a civics teacher with 20 years in the district, dimmed the projector lights and played the segment for her 11th grade government and society class. The room, usually drowsy by 8 a.m., fell into complete stillness. Jasmine's voice cut through the space with an intimacy that whiteboards and textbooks could never replicate. When the video ended, Miss Medina didn't ask for reactions. She didn't have to. A Latina student in the front row raised her hand and said, "Why have we never studied someone like her before?" Another added, "That wasn't just an answer. That was armor." Ms. Medina nodded once, and for the first time all semester, rewrote her lesson plan on the spot. "Today," she said, "we're going to talk about how leadership looks different than we've been taught." Across the country, similar moments unfolded. Teachers played Jasmine's clip in debate classes, media literacy courses, even history periods typically reserved for dead men in powdered wigs. One middle school counselor printed her quote and taped it outside her office door. In Berkeley, a sociology professor added the panel segment to their syllabus under the new unit: Power, Gender, and Precision. A university student newspaper called it the first viral moment in years that didn't beg for your attention. It demanded your reflection. Yet for all the celebration, the backlash surged in equal force. Comment sections overflowed with the usual bile: race baiting, feminist nonsense, another angry liberal trying to cancel tradition. One conservative influencer mocked the TikTok trend by staging a parody video. He sat in a suit, mimicked Jasmine's posture, then burst out laughing before delivering her quote in a cartoon voice. The clip was taken down for harassment within hours, but not before being reposted by dozens of reactionaries calling her a crisis actor for the progressive left. Still, the impact refused to be reduced to ridicule. Jasmine's silence became its own kind of message. She didn't repost the edits, didn't comment on the trends, didn't bask in the viral waves. Her restraint was interpreted by some as strategy, by others as strength. But one thing was undeniable: her face, her voice, her presence, once dismissed as too much, had become the standard by which young women were measuring their own. Because what Jasmine had done was not just speak truth to power. She gave others the language, the body, the breath, to speak it too. And when someone who has been silenced finally speaks, the most radical thing you can do is listen. As Jasmine's silence became a symbol and her voice an anthem, the nation turned its attention to the man across from her, not for what he had said, but for what he had tried to keep buried. The flood began with a single voice, quiet but sharp, the kind that slices cleaner than rage. A woman in her mid-40s, former campaign aide to Clint Eastwood during his short-lived political advisory tenure in the early 2000s, posted a letter to Medium. No frills, no disclaimers, just the title, "I was there, and I remember." In the opening paragraph, she recalled being 22, fresh out of Stanford, hired onto Eastwood's campaign communications team. "It was a dream job," she wrote, "until I realized the only thing I was allowed to offer was coffee or silence." The post caught traction within hours, boosted by journalists, organizers, and quiet retweets from public figures who never said her name but knew her story. She didn't accuse him of harassment. She didn't need to. Her indictment came in the form of dismissal, years of meetings where her voice was waved off, of suggestions discarded until repeated by a man 2 seats over. But the line that ignited the internet came midway through the second page. "Clint didn't shout. He didn't need to. He just looked at me once and said, 'You're smart, but too young and too female. You'll burn out if you try to lead.'" That quote alone was enough to reopen wounds for millions of women who had heard the same sentiment in different words, behind different desks, from men just like him. By midday, the story had been picked up by Politico, HuffPost, and The Guardian. But what truly detonated the moment wasn't the letter. It was the leak. An email from 2012 surfaced, released by a former chief of staff after internal documents were subpoenaed in a separate political investigation. In the exchange, Clint had responded to a proposed appointment of a female attorney to a judicial ethics board. His reply, terse and unfiltered, read, "She's bright, sure, but put her under pressure and she'll cry. Do we really want another meltdown on live TV?" The email had been forwarded to 2 senior staffers and a Republican donor. One had replied with a laughing emoji. The internet didn't pause, it erupted. Screenshots of the email spread like blood in water. Hashtags morphed overnight. Two female began trending alongside us meltdown politics. Women began stitching the quote into their social posts, not to mock him, but to weaponize his words against him. One influencer posted a video of herself crying in a bathroom stall after being dismissed by a boardroom full of men. Her caption read, "This is what you feared, Clint? Then you feared the wrong thing." Cable news seized the story. CNN hosted a panel of former staffers and campaign veterans, men and women alike, who began sharing stories. A former scheduler recalled being told not to wear red lipstick around Clint because he finds it distracting. Another revealed she had written entire press statements later attributed to her male supervisor. And suddenly, the man who had sat stone-faced on the American Hour, confident in his stoicism, found himself being recast, not as a weathered hero of a bygone era, but as a relic of its rot. But perhaps what made the moment volcanic wasn't just the letter or the email. It was the timing. It came just as young women across America were rediscovering their power, standing taller because of Jasmine's words, shedding fear, finding new posture in old rooms. And now they were asking a question Clint hadn't prepared for. What else have you silenced? Because if his on-air remark wasn't an anomaly but a pattern, then what else had he edited out of the record? What voices had never made it past the draft stage because someone like him decided they weren't ready? Op-eds exploded. The Washington Tribune ran a front-page editorial titled, "Not a Legend." A scathing paragraph read, "Eastwood didn't just underestimate Jasmine Crockett. He underestimated every woman who'd ever sat in silence and swallowed her brilliance for the comfort of a man who refused to listen." Meanwhile, right-wing pundits scrambled to reframe the fallout. "Cancel culture's back," one declared on air. "They want to erase a lifetime of service because of one or two sentences." But the words were never the problem. It was the worldview behind them, the slow, quiet erosion of women's presence in rooms of power. And now that erosion had a face. Even Eastwood's own biographers, longtime defenders of his legacy, found themselves grappling. One, in an NPR interview, said, "He was a symbol of American grit for decades. But grit without accountability becomes mythology, and myth, when cracked, spills truth." Through it all, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. Her silence grew louder as the noise around Clint turned chaotic. She didn't have to speak. The world was doing the math for her. If one moment had triggered this much exposure, how much had gone unseen? How many women had held their stories in their throats for decades, afraid of backlash, of being called too much, or worse, not being believed at all? Because in the end, legacy isn't just about what a man builds, it's also about what he breaks on the way. And now, as the nation re-examined the man who had once embodied the strong, silent American archetype, they began to ask, was his silence strength or just a smokescreen? Just when the echoes from Clint's reconciliation attempt began to fade, Jasmine's office inbox exploded, revealing that the battlefield had moved off-screen and into her real life. The first message arrived at 3:17 a.m. Its sender was anonymous, an untraceable email address, a red flag, no subject line, only 3 terse sentences. "You humiliated an American icon. Be careful when you leave your house." The glass in Jasmine's office felt colder when she read it. Outside, the city lights blurred in the early dawn. Inside, the words pulsed like warnings, invisible, unrelenting, disallowed. She looked at her staff. They avoided her gaze. The seriousness wasn't lost on them. Security protocol activated. They had thought the war was over after the debate, but this was different. It was intimate, personal, warning not just to knock her down, but to make her afraid to stand again. And yet, even as fear threaded through their corridors, something else poured in, like light flooding a locked room. Thousands of emails from women, from girls, from mothers, veterans, teachers, nurses. Each subject line began with, "Thank you," followed by stories of being silenced. "Thank you for saying what my parents told me to swallow. Thank you for words women like me could never speak. Thank you for fighting while I couldn't." They were stark and soulful, earnest delineations of pain and gratitude. One said, "Because of you, I marched into my boss's office and asked for a promotion." Another wrote, "My 14-year-old daughter heard your pause and learned she didn't need to wait." Jasmine reread one particular letter until the ink bled warm on her phone screen. Young woman confessed she'd been passed over for a job after being called too aggressive, too loud, too black. But hearing Jasmine had given her permission to speak, to persist, to step forward, changed everything. The room felt electric, like she was no longer standing alone. Her cause had become their cause. But the threat and the hope existed on the same plane now, and she couldn't ignore either. She paced the office, hardwood floors creaking beneath her boots, as she weighed her next move. The optics of a woman preparing to go dark, to cancel interviews, to retreat into security. Would that silence echo louder than the threats? She had been advised as much. Lay low. Don't give him more oxygen. But her mother called just as the sun began to rise. Jasmine held the phone like a lifeline. Her mother's voice was soft, but unflinching. Don't let them scare you, she said. You didn't fight your whole life to vanish from sound when people finally started listening. You don't stay quiet now. No ifs, no questions, just certainty. A moral bolt sealing her resolve. Jasmine's fingers tightened on the phone. She inhaled deliberately. Fear was still there. It had no right to leave, but so was something stronger. Commitment. She realized that backing down now wouldn't stop the threats. It would signal victory to the silencing forces. And she didn't do this for herself. She did it because of that little girl on the screen, because of the women writing their futures again. So she stepped into the light. Scrolling through the emails one more time, she selected a few with public blessing to highlight on national television and on her social accounts. She took a deep breath. The desk was her podium. The emails were her armor. And she would be seen and heard, not just as a voice on TV, but as a face facing fear itself. Because bravery doesn't just come from winning the spotlight, it comes from standing in it while knowing someone wants to turn it off. After days of death threats and declarations of gratitude, Jasmine realized the real battleground wasn't a television studio. It was the future itself. And this time, the spotlight didn't scare her. It called her. The double doors of the Senate hearing room opened slowly, deliberately, mahogany paneled, guarded by marble columns, and lined with cameras humming in near-silent expectation. The gold-plated sign on the wall read, Committee on Generational Policy and Public Futures. Beneath it, 60 senators sat in attention, flanked by aides, papers, advisors. They had heard speeches before. They had seen firebrands, theorists, and seasoned patriots. But today was different. Jasmine Crockett stepped through the entrance, not with flair, not with fury, but with calm that felt like incoming thunder. No entourage, no written notes, just the deep blue blazer she always wore, her silver vote pin glinting against the collar like quiet defiance. Her hair was pulled back, tightly braided, but her voice would not be. She approached the podium, microphones adjusted, lights focused. Reporters scribbled, expecting a moment, but Jasmine stood still, longer than anyone expected. The silence wrapped the room in friction. She wasn't performing. She was preparing to carve clarity into the nation's bones. I was invited here, she began, her voice steady, not raised, to speak about the role of generations in public policy. But I'm not here to describe a demographic trend. I'm here to confront a democratic emergency. Eyes lifted. Pens paused. She continued, we are a nation that funds prisons more swiftly than public schools, that dismisses emotion as weakness and regards pain as inconvenience. That says, respect your elders, but rarely asks them to respect the world the young are forced to inherit. Her tone didn't rise, but it pierced. We are standing on legislation built decades ago for a country that no longer exists, and when we try to challenge it, we're told it's not our turn. I'm here to say, our turn began the moment we started paying the cost. The senators shifted. Some stiffened, others leaned in. A few younger aides near the back scribbled furiously. Jasmine moved closer to the microphone, not for amplification, but for intimacy. I was called too loud, too angry, too emotional. But let me ask you, how quiet should one be when a school child passes out in July because air conditioning isn't seen as a right? Her voice sharpened, not to accuse, but to awaken. How calm should a mother be when her child's school library is replaced with QR codes because books are deemed too expensive, but bullets never are? A murmur spread across the chamber. Jasmine didn't flinch. And I was told, by someone who once symbolized American grit, that leadership comes from silence, from sacrifice, from knowing when to step back. Well, I've sacrificed. My mother worked nights as a nurse until her legs swelled and her back curved into a question mark. I've stepped back, plenty of times, from jobs, from meetings, from respect I had earned. But I've never been silent, and I never will be. She paused, looked out, not just at senators, but through the lens of every camera broadcasting the hearing across the country. Clint Eastwood was invited today. He declined. He said, quote, "That fight's not worth it." Jasmine let that statement hang in the air, heavier than any accusation. To those who believe that the fight for equality, access, inclusion, and representation is not worth it, let me assure you, it's not because the battle is beneath them. It's because they fear losing it. That line drew a visible reaction. The older senators stirred. Some bristled, some blinked, but no one interrupted. People don't fear loud women because we're chaotic. They fear us because we are clear. Clear about what is broken, clear about what we remember, clear about what we will no longer tolerate. And then Jasmine did something unexpected. She smiled, softly, not with triumph, but with belief. I'm not here today just as a congresswoman. I'm here as someone who still remembers sitting in a school hallway, writing poems in the margins of worksheets, wondering if anyone would ever hear my voice. I'm here because I know there's a girl doing that right now. And if this chamber has the courage to invest in her future, not just honor someone else's past, then we can finally call this democracy ours. Not borrowed, not filtered. Ours. A hush spread through the room. No one looked at their watches. She closed with a single sentence. If America has room for guns in budgets, prisons in suburbs, and monuments to men who never imagined women like me standing here, then it better have room for our voices in the rooms where policy is born. She stepped back from the microphone. No applause, no music cue. Just a silence so complete it felt sacred. A silence that had nothing to do with intimidation and everything to do with reverence. Because this time Jasmine didn't win with volume. She won with vision. The room never applauded, but it didn't need to. The weight of Jasmine's words echoed louder than any standing ovation. And as she stepped down from the podium, it wasn't just a moment that ended, it was an era. She descended the marble steps of the chamber without haste, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. No cameras rushed her, no staffers swarmed her. There was no chant, no raised fists, no orchestrated celebration. And yet something in the air shifted, like the hush after a storm that changes the landscape forever. Jasmine Crockett did not walk out of that hearing room with applause. She walked out with the future watching her. A young page opened the side door, hands slightly trembling. He had seen senators leave in pride and others in shame, but never like this. Jasmine met his eyes for a second, just long enough to offer a small nod. A nod that said, "Yes, you saw it. You're part of it now." Outside, the sun was beginning to set. The marble columns of the Capitol cast long, golden shadows across the steps, and the sky burned in the streaks of orange and defiant crimson. Reporters stood in silence. The usual frenzy had paused. They had all recorded something that could not be edited down into sound bites, only replayed in full. One of them finally broke the silence. "Congresswoman Crockett, any final words?" She turned only slightly, her voice low and firm. "I'm not sorry I was heard. I'm sorry it took until 2025 for a moment like this to happen." And with that, she walked past the microphones, straight into history. Across the country, the ripple became a wave. That evening, the Washington Sentinel ran a front-page spread with a photo of Clint Eastwood and Jasmine Crockett in split frame. Two generations frozen in conflict. The headline didn't scream. It whispered, "Clint brought legacy. Jasmine brought tomorrow." It was poetic but not flattery, a quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had occurred. Not a victory, not a toppling, but a transition. The kind of shift that doesn't roar in real time, but redefines the air we breathe afterward. The networks tried to frame it in opposite tones. Fox ran with "Respect eclipsed by rebellion." CNN declared, a voice that changed the room. But no Chiron, no analyst, no partisan filter could fully reclaim what had happened. It had already escaped the spin cycle and lodged itself into public memory. In living rooms and classrooms, cafes and barbershops, people replayed that final line. Some wrote it down. Others whispered it to themselves, as if confirming it had really been said. "I'm not sorry I was heard." Some called her reckless. Some called her revolutionary. But no one called her forgettable. In a suburban kitchen in Detroit, a mother folded laundry while her teenage daughter, eyes wide, watched the hearing clip again on her cracked iPad. "She talks like you do, Mama," the girl said. The mother smiled but didn't reply. There were no words for that kind of recognition. In a high school in Arizona, a government teacher erased the day's lesson and played the full 23-minute hearing instead. "Forget your textbooks," she told her class. "This is civics." And on a rural porch in Texas, an old veteran who had once voted for Clint leaned back in his chair, took a long sip of coffee, and said to no one in particular, "Well, damn, maybe it is their turn." There were no fireworks, no ticker tape, no statue unveiled, just a silent understanding, passing from one hand to the next, like the moment in a relay where the baton changes runners, not with noise but with perfect timing. Some called it the end of Clint Eastwood's influence. Others saw it as Jasmine Crockett's rise. But most would later agree. It wasn't a conquest, it was a handoff, and it could not be taken back. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.